Hi, Corbin and Boaz, it's Honey. This book is called Paddington Bear in the Garden. Here's our title page, and oh my, Paddington is soaking his plants while he is reading a book called How to Plan Your Garden. So there's our title, Paddington Bear in the Garden. The author is Michael Bond. Pictures by R.W. Alley. That means that one person wrote the book and another person drew the pictures. And I do love Paddington Bear. Look how happy he looks with little snowflakes falling on his face. Oh, so Paddington Bear is famous because he loves marmalade. He's a sweet bear character. One morning, Paddington took some paper and a pencil into the garden and began making a list of all the nice things he could think of about being a bear and living with the Browns. To start with, he had a room of his own and a warm bed to sleep in. And he had marmalade for breakfast every morning. In darkest Peru, he had only been allowed to have it on Sundays. The list grew longer and longer, and he had nearly run out of paper before he realized he left out one of the nicest things of all. The garden! Paddington liked the Browns' garden. Apart from the occasional noise of a nearby building site, it was so quiet and peaceful it did not seem like being in London at all. But nice gardens don't just happen. They usually require a lot of hard work, and the one at number 32 Windsor Gardens was no exception. Mr. Brown had to mow the lawn twice a week. And Mrs. Brown kept busy weeding the flower beds. There was always something to do. Even Mrs. Bird lent a hand whenever she had a spare moment. It was Mrs. Bird who first suggested giving Jonathan and Judy and Paddington each a piece of garden. "It will keep certain bears out of mischief," she said meaningfully, "and it'll help you both at the same time." Mr. Brown agreed it was a very good idea, and he measured out 3 plots at the far end of the garden. Paddington was the most excited. "I don't suppose there are many bears who have their own garden," he exclaimed. There's Paddington. He's looking at his future garden spot. And this must be Jonathan and Judy. Early the next morning, all 3 set to work. Judy decided to make a flower bed. Jonathan had his eye on some old paving stones, but Paddington didn't know what to do. In the past, he had often found gardening was much harder than it looked, especially when you only had paws. In the end, armed with a jar of Mrs. Bird's homemade marmalade, he set off. In the end, armed with a jar of Mrs. Bird's homemade marmalade, he borrowed Mr. Brown's wheelbarrow and set off to look for ideas. I don't think a wheelbarrow should be used to stand in. What do you think? His first stop was a booth in the market, and there he bought a book called How to Plan Your Garden by Lionel Trugg. And there he is, reading the book. The book came complete with a large packet of assorted seeds, and if the picture on the front cover was anything to go by, gardening must be very relaxing. Mr. Trugg seemed to do most of his planning while lying in a hammock. By the end of the book, without lifting a finger, he was surrounded by blooms of every possible size and color. Paddington decided it was a very good value indeed, especially when the owner of the booth gave him 2 pence change. Mr. Trug's book was full of useful tips, and Paddington couldn't wait to get started. The very first tip suggested that before starting work, it was a good idea to close your eyes and try to picture what the garden would look like when it was finished. Having walked into a lamppost by mistake, whoops! Paddington decided to read another page or two, and there he found a much better idea. Mr. Trug advised standing back and looking at the site from a safe distance, preferably somewhere up high. As Paddington thought about his yard at number 32 Windsor Place, he knew just the spot. By the time Paddington reached the building site near the Browns' house, it was the middle of the morning and all the men were on their tea break. Placing his jar of marmalade on the wooden platform for safekeeping, there it is. He sat on a pile of bricks for a rest while he considered the matter. There was no one around, and there was a ladder nearby. Mr. Trug was quite right. The Browns' garden did indeed look very different from high up. Judy was digging away at her patch, and not far away, Jonathan was trying to break, a paving stone in two. Just then, Paddington heard the sound of an engine starting, and standing well back in case Mrs. Bird saw him, he peered through a gap in the boards. On the ground below him, a man was emptying a load of concrete on the very spot where Paddington had left his jar of marmalade. Paddington scrambled back down the ladder as fast as his legs would carry him, reaching the bottom just as the foreman came around the corner. "Is anything wrong?" asked the man. "You look upset." "My jar's been buried," exclaimed Paddington hotly, pointing to the pile of concrete. "It had some of Mrs. Bird's best golden chunks in it, too." The foreman called his men together. "There's a young bear gentleman here who's lost something valuable. Better get cracking." "I won't ask how your jar got there," he said, turning to Paddington as the men set to work clearing the concrete into small piles, "or what you were doing up the ladder." "I'm very glad of that," said Paddington, politely raising his hat. Suddenly there was a whirring sound from somewhere overhead, and to Paddington's surprise, the platform landed at his feet. "My marmalade!" he exclaimed thankfully. "Your marmalade?" repeated the foreman, staring at the jar. "Did you say marmalade?" "Well, that's right. I put it right there for my 11s. It must have been taken up by a mistake, and now the top's come off." It was the foreman's turn to look as though he could hardly believe his eyes. "That's special quick-drying cement. It's probably rock hard already, ruined by a bear's marmalade. No one will even give me 2 pence for it now." "I will," said Paddington, "for I've had an idea." It took Paddington several trips to take all the lumps of concrete home in the wheelbarrow, and it kept him busy for most of the week. When the builders saw the rock garden he had made, they were most impressed, and the foreman even gave Paddington some plants to finish it off until his seeds started to grow. It's National Garden Day on Saturday. There are some very famous people judging it. I'll spread the word around. You never know your luck. The foreman was as good as his word, and Saturday half the neighborhood showed up at number 32 Windsor Gardens to see the judges arrive. Paddington nearly fell over backward when he discovered that no less a person than Mr. Lionel Trug himself was leading the procession. Do you remember who Lionel Trug is? He's the man who wrote the book on gardening. It's very good to see you get out of your hammock, Mr. Chug, he explained. Not at all, said Lionel Chug. My pleasure, my pleasure. I must say I love your orange stones. Where did you find them? I didn't, said Paddington. I think they found me, thanks to the builders. Congratulations, said Mr. Chug, as he handed Paddington a gold star. It's good to see a young bear take up gardening. I hope you will be the first of many. And to show how pleased he was, he gave Jonathan and Judy a silver medal too, so they wouldn't feel left out. Who would have believed it, said Mr. Brown as the last of the crowd departed. You must write and tell Aunt Lucy all about it. They'll be very excited in the Home for Retired Bears in Peru when they hear the news. Paddington thought it was a good idea, but he had to do something first. He had to add one more important item to his list of things that he was thankful for: having my own rock garden. Then he signed his name and added his special paw print, just to show that it was genuine. The end.